We sift through the sources, find the key lessons, and basically give you the full picture without you having to read everything yourself.
And today, we're looking at the work and, I guess, the philosophy of Australian journalist and author Julieta Jameson.
Right. Her career is fascinating. It spans, well, everything from hard news to deeply personal memoirs.
Yeah, and it tells us a lot about shifts in media, travel, even how we tell personal stories. The goal here is really to pull out lessons on the craft of writing and maybe the importance of being authentic.
And the source material is just so varied. I mean, covering mass shootings and celebrities in LA as a foreign correspondent,
Then tracing Lord Byron's footsteps through Europe.
and writing about Australia's most remote territory during a major political crisis. It's quite a journey. So, okay, let's unpack
We'll
this.
start at the beginning, the sort of journalistic DNA.
Yeah, the foundation. Where did it all start for her?
Well, the foundation seems really key. She didn't just jump into features. She really cut her teeth in demanding places.
Like where specifically?
Okay, so there was a cadetship at 3DB covering racing, of all things, then some time at the ABC,
Uh-huh.
and then a really formative gig at Business Review Weekly back in the 80s.
BRW in the 80s. That was the era of big corporate takeovers, right? The sort of greed is good vibe.
Exactly. That was the glamour round. But even there, you see her versatility. She's covering these huge, complex business deals.
But also profiling the band Crowded House for a business magazine.
Right. It shows that ability to find a human or cultural story even within a specialized context.
Yeah.
And that skill, that blending, really defined her time in Los Angeles for News Limited.
Okay, the foreign correspondent years, what was that like?
Just incredibly broad. Her beat covered, well, everything. One day it's movie stars and red carpets.
Standard LA correspondent stuff.
Yeah, but the next day she's reporting on major crime. Things like mass shootings or that really high-profile JonBenet Ramsey murder case in Boulder.
Wow. That's quite the swing from Hollywood glamour to, well, that kind of tragedy and scrutiny.
Exactly. And that kind of whiplash, that chaos versus glamour, is probably why she emphasizes the craft of writing so much.
How so? What's her philosophy there?
She talks a lot about structure, like always thinking in terms of Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Doesn't matter if it's a big feature or just a short news piece.
Applying narrative structure to news.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And the absolute #1 rule,
Hmm.
don't bury the lead. You have to grab the reader immediately, especially when you're filing from overseas, competing for attention.
Makes sense. Get to the point.
But it's more than just the basic structure. She uses stylistic tricks, too, like something called the echo.
The echo, what's that?
It's where you start a piece with a certain image or little scene, and then you circle back to something similar at the very end. It gives it this sense of closure, like emotional resonance.
Okay, I see. It frames the story nicely.
And speaking of craft, she really highlights the role of editors. There's this fantastic anecdote.
The paddle pop story. We have to tell this one.
Definitely. So she finds out this, frankly, kind of bizarre little fact. A batch of chocolate paddle pops accidentally got some banana paddle pop mixture in them.
Okay. Sounds like a tiny, maybe funny news brief. A filler item.
That's what she thought. But she mentions it to her editor, Cole Allen.
Who later went on to edit the New York Post, right? So a guy with serious news judgment.
Exactly. And he didn't see a filler fact. He saw a front-page story.
About banana flavor in chocolate ice cream.
He told her to frame it not as a factory mistake, but as a crisis. He literally called it the Great Paddle Pop Shortage.
Uh-huh. Brilliant. Finding that human angle, the outrage over a childhood favorite being messed up.
Precisely. It took that editorial eye to see the narrative potential, the shared cultural resonance, and turn a quirky fact into a headline people actually cared about. The perfect example of craft elevating reporting.
And that discipline, that ability to find the story, seems like it paved the way for her move into longer-form nonfiction, right? Exploring Australian identity.
Absolutely. Which brings us nicely to figures like Cliffy Young.
The potato farmer who won the ultramarathon. An icon.
Yeah, her book, Cliffy. The Cliff Young story came out in 2012, almost 30 years after he famously won the Sydney to Melbourne race in 1983. He was 61.
Such an amazing story. But didn't he become a bit simplified? Like a caricature?
That's exactly what the book tackled. She mentions how he sort of became a punchline. The book aimed to get past that, to find the real Cliffy.
So moving beyond the shuffle and the gumboots.
Yeah, documenting this genuinely humble person who achieved something extraordinary through sheer grit. really. It felt like an attempt to restore the human behind the media myth.
And that search for, I guess, authentic Australian stories continues in her other work, too.
Definitely. Look at The Ties That Bind from 2002. This one was inspired by a documentary.
What was the premise?
It followed six quite well-known Australians people, like the comedian Mary Custas, the rugby player Craig Wing, as they traveled back to their families' countries of origin.
Oh, interesting. Like heritage journeys.
Exactly. Places like Lebanon, Greece, Samoa, China, the Philippines, Canada. Often they went with a parent or grandparent who hadn't been back in decades.
That sounds incredibly emotional.
It really explores those connections, the ties of heritage, and how those personal journeys shape identity, both of the individuals and for multicultural Australia. It highlights how personal stories are also political and cultural.
That idea of journeying for self-discovery, it seems like it takes a really sharp personal turn in her next major work.
It does. And this is where that journalistic rigor, that structure she honed, becomes so important for handling something deeply personal and, frankly, quite raw.
Okay, now we're getting into Me, Myself, and Lord Byron. This one sounds fascinating. A parallel journey.
It really is. Published in 2011, the setup is Jameson is facing her own kind of personal crisis, dealing with things like alcohol dependence. And she decides to use the poet Lord Byron as a sort of guide.
Lord Byron, the romantic poet. Why him?
Well, the historical context is key. Byron was, you could argue, the first true rock star. Huge celebrity, incredibly talented, but also scandalous.
Right, the rumors, incest, sodomy. He had to leave England, didn't he?
In 1816, yeah, self-imposed exile. He was chased out by scandal and never went back. So Jameson, approaching her mid-40s and feeling a bit adrift herself,
Decides to follow his path.
literally retraces his exile journey through Switzerland, Italy, Greece.
Oh.
She uses his life, his locations, these pilgrimage points, she calls them, as a way to confront her own stuff.
Using a historical figure's path to navigate her own emotional landscape, that's a really interesting approach.
But Byron's perfect because he was so flawed, so controversial, but also so completely unapologetically himself. She wrote about how getting close to his story helped her sort of introduce herself to her own authentic self, even at 46.
It suggests that sometimes maybe you need an external framework, even a historical one, to make sense of your own internal chaos.
Exactly. It's a powerful demonstration of using Byron's narrative to reshape your own.
So from that very personal internal journey, her focus seems to shift outwards again towards a major political and geopolitical issue with the Christmas Island book.
That's right. Christmas Island, Indian Ocean. Originally published in 2003, but interestingly re-released in 2021.
And what sparked this one? Back to her journalistic roots.
Very much so.
Hmm.
She actually heard an ABC radio interview. It was with the harbor master on Christmas Island, talking about the Tampa crisis back in 2001.
Okay, the Tampa. That was a huge moment in Australian politics. The Norwegian ship rescuing hundreds of asylum seekers.
Over 400, yeah, from a sinking fishing boat near the island.
Yeah.
And the Australian government refused to let them land.
Which led directly to the Howard government's Pacific Solution, the whole offshore processing policy.
Exactly. So her book is basically a first-hand account of what life was like on Christmas Island during that incredibly tense period right in the eye of the storm.
What was her main takeaway, especially with the re-release nearly 20 years later?
That was the really striking part. She noted that the fundamental questions raised back then about borders, about how we treat asylum seekers, the moral and political debates they were, in her words, every bit as relevant and important today.
Wow. The sense that maybe not much had fundamentally changed in the debate, despite 2 decades passing.
It's a pretty sobering observation on the normalization of those policies. But the book isn't just politics. It also has these incredible descriptions of the island itself.
Like the red crabs, I read about that part.
Oh, yeah, the annual red crab migration. Millions, just vast swaths of these endemic crabs pouring down from the forest to the coast to mate.
And they just go, regardless of what's in their way.
Apparently. She describes them literally going up and over buildings that humans have built right across their ancient migration path.
That's an amazing image. This unstoppable force of nature contrasted with the immediate human political drama playing out.
It's a really powerful juxtaposition. The frantic human crisis versus the slow, inevitable rhythm of the natural world.
Which, in a way, brings us to maybe the most relevant section for anyone listening who's involved in writing or media today. Editing and the pressures on the industry.
Yes. And Jameson has a really strong view on editing. She calls it an art.
Not just proofreading or fixing typos.
Definitely not. She says it requires instinct, a real feel for language. It's absolutely not a production line job, as she puts it.
And she learned some pretty rigorous systems herself, didn't she? Something called time speak.
Yeah, apparently she learned that working at Who Weekly.
Sure.
And for anyone unfamiliar, TimeSpeak was this highly structured, almost formulaic editorial style developed for magazines like Time and People.
Very focused on clarity, concision, flow, like a science behind the art.
Exactly, it demands precision. But that whole philosophy, editing as an art requiring skill and nuance, ran headfirst into economic reality around 2015.
What happened then?
Well, digital media was under huge pressure to cut costs. And this blew up into a public debate when the online publisher Mamamia advertised for sub-editors.
But not in Australia.
No, specifically advertising for part-time sub-editors based in India and Bangladesh.
Ah, the offshoring debate.
Precisely. And the economics were just stark. At the time, the minimum wage for a fairly junior sub-editor in Australia was around $44,000 a year.
Okay. And the average salary for a copy editor in India?
The sources we looked at cited it as being closer to $4,854 a year.
Wow. Okay. That's a massive difference. You can see the economic driver immediately.
Absolutely. But the industry bodies, like the MEAA, the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, they raised serious alarms.
What were their concerns? Quality?
Primarily, yes. The risk of compromising quality, losing essential cultural nuance, because an editor offshore might not get local references or context.
Like the Paddle Pop story. An editor unfamiliar with Australian childhood nostalgia might totally miss why that's a story.
Exactly. And the potential for just basic costly errors slipping through because that local knowledge is missing.
So what was Jameson's take on this specific controversy?
Her argument tied back to her core belief. She said that precisely because editing was being devalued, treated like a commodity, like something you just find the cheapest version of.
Yeah.
She hoped that this very denigration might actually make the field ripe for resurgence, that maybe people would start to realize what was being lost and value it properly again. A bit paradoxical, but you see her point.
Yeah, that the crisis might force a reevaluation of what skilled editing actually contributes. Interesting. And where does all this leave her now? Has she stayed in journalism?
Well, this shows her adaptability again. She's pivoted significantly towards screenwriting.
Makes sense. The core still story, structure, character are transferable.
Totally. She apparently has 2 projects in development or optioned. One sounds like a twist on a classic Christmas rom-com, and the other is based on true events featuring Indian characters.
So the person who could find the narrative in a flawed ice cream, trace Byron's steps, and dissect the Tampa crisis is now applying that same structural discipline to film scripts.
It really demonstrates the power of those foundational journalistic skills. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 applies everywhere.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this for the listener. If you look at this whole varied, impressive career, what's the big takeaway?
I think it really boils down to 2 main things that seem to underpin all her work, regardless of the topic or medium.
Which are?
First, authenticity. Whether it's Byron being unapologetically himself, or her own raw honesty in the memoir, or finding the real Cliffy Young, there's a drive towards genuine expression.
Okay, authenticity. And the second?
Just meticulous, relentless craft. Knowing the rules of storytelling, respecting structure, never burying the lead, using tools like the echo. It's the marriage of that vulnerable authenticity with disciplined execution.
Authenticity plus craft equals powerful storytelling. Makes sense.
And if you connect that back to the industry pressures we talked about, that tension between the art of craft and the economics, it becomes really pointed.
Right. We saw the numbers. The huge cost difference between local, potentially nuanced editing and offshore, cheaper editing. $44,000 versus maybe $5,000.
It leads to a pretty critical question, doesn't it?
Which is?
Well, in a world where these crucial journalistic skills, like sub-editing, are increasingly treated like interchangeable commodities, something to be bought at the lowest possible price, what actually happens to the art of storytelling?
Yeah, what's the long-term cost when the value placed on quality, on nuance, on getting it right is constantly being undercut just to save money?
And maybe more importantly for us, as people who consume media, how do we learn to spot the difference? How do we value and maybe even demand the kind of careful, culturally aware artistry that produces a truly resonant, accurate story compared to something just churned out quickly and cheaply?
That difference in valuation, it ultimately shapes the entire information landscape we all live in. It's definitely something to think about.
A lot to chew on there.
Indeed. Well, that seems like a perfect place to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for exploring Julieta Jameson's work with us.
My pleasure. Until next time.